Well, I mean, definitely in the beginning, I had no intention or whatsoever that what I was practicing and what I'm still practicing now would lead to this to begin with. But martial art has a very, very deep meaning as far as my life is concerned.
Hello guys, and welcome to this week's edition of the Bloodsport podcast. In today's show, I'm going to be running through a recap on this weekend's UFC fight night. I'm going to talk about the latest on Conor McGregor's next opponent, and I'm going to look at Jon Jones' ongoing battle with the UFC. Before I discuss the main event between Woodley and Burns, I'd like to go back to Dana White's pre-fight media scrum. A journalist had asked him the question if there was going to be any difference in the production between the full-size arena in Jacksonville versus what we're going to see in the Apex. And Dana came out and he basically lied directly to our faces. He said there's not going to be any change at all. Immediately when the cameras start rolling, I started noticing these downlights that started revolving around the arena, and they even revolved during the fights. Also, the venue wasn't actually blackened out, so you could see the four walls of the venue and you could see the movement of people in the background. So it didn't look anything like it did in Jacksonville, where the entire arena was blacked out and all you could see was the cage. The second difference, and this one pissed me off, was the fact that they were using the small octagon as opposed to the full-sized one. Just a bit of background on this for those who may not be fully aware. The UFC basically have two different sized octagons. For the smaller fight nights, they tend to use the smaller ones. The difference between the two is the bigger one is 20% wider and it's 44% larger in area than the smaller one. So there's a pretty considerable difference between the two. But anyways, that's enough of that. Let's get on to having a look at the actual main event first. I'll park that to the side, but I'm just going to say, Dana, don't play us like that. Don't lie to us like that. So Tyron Woodley versus Gilbert Burns. It was a very interesting fight, let's put it. I think there was a lot to learn from this, and many people have been saying that it's the passing of the guard, and to be honest, I have to agree with them. I think Gilbert just had so many different shots in his locker. He was hitting Woodley with some stiff jabs. He was throwing double hooks, which you very rarely see in MMA because most fighters wouldn't be able to get away with throwing them. His leg kicks were absolutely vicious. He had Tyron wincing and shaking off kicks at times, and you could tell from his face he was actually acknowledging how good the kicks were during the fight, which I thought was relatively strange because he was showing that they were hurting. But they were terrifying. I'm sure Tyron is struggling to walk at the moment after eating so many of them, but to his credit, he managed to take them all as the former champ that he once was. All credit to Gilbert Burns. It's going to be interesting to see when the rankings are updated to where he's actually going to be placed, because dare I say, he won't be too far off an actual title fight if he can get maybe another win together against another top-ranked opponent. As for Woodley, I don't really know where this leaves his career at the moment. He came out on Sunday evening saying that he was definitely not hanging up the gloves and that he was going to keep his head held high, and I guess as he should, and he's going to fight on. I don't really know where this leaves his career at the moment. He came out on Sunday evening saying that he was definitely not hanging up the gloves and that he was going to keep his head held high, and I guess as he should, and he's going to fight on. If he does, I think he's effectively going to become the gatekeeper for the division, but he has had some career looking back on, and he should be unbelievably proud of that. He snatched the title from Robbie Lawler, who is definitely one of the most feared welterweight champions of all time, and he did go on to have 4 defences before losing to Usman. I wish him well in whatever he decides to do, but hey Tyron, that rap career, I'm not too sure if that's the answer. Maybe pursue the Hollywood one instead. But just going back to Gilbert Burns, personally I'd really like to see him fight Leon Edwards next. I think if he could manage to stall Leon's career, he'd be definitely worthy of a title shot. I know that Edwards hasn't fought in close to a year, so I'm sure that he's very anxious to get back in the cage as soon as possible. But personally, I think that would be a great stylistic matchup for both himself and Burns. And I think whoever wins the fight, it would prove very beneficial to either of them. But I guess we're just going to have to see how that one plays itself out. On a final side note, I'd just love to give a hat tip to Tyron Woodley's cut man. I think the job he done so early on in the fight was incredible. I was really thinking that if that cut got hit a couple more times, it could have looked something like Tyson Fury's from when he fought Otto Wallin, and that wasn't too pleasant at all. Even after the fight, Woodley had to get 12 stitches on that eye, so it's a real credit to the cut man, and I'm sure he's going to be a man in demand after that fight, so all credit to him. Anyways, I'm going to move on, and I'm just going to look at one more fight from the weekend's card, and it was one of the most fun fights I've seen in a long time. It was a catchweight bout at 150 between Spike the Alpha Ginger Carlisle versus Billy Quarantillo. Carlisle seems to have already developed a real cult following. I think aside from his skills in the octagon, it's his appearance and just his personality that really stand out from most fighters. I think Michael Bisping just kept on referring to him during his commentary as wild. And I think that's the perfect term to describe him. He reminded me of a ginger Post Malone with his hair tied up in cornrows and his facial expression when he flashed his gum shield during Joe Martinez announcing of him before the fight. But I'll tell you what, the pace that Carlisle came out with in the first round was absolutely frightening. From darting off the cage, he reminded me of Jorge Masvidal from when he knocked out Ben Askren. But it was sheer dominance in the first round. I think Billy had come out saying that he was a one-round fighter and that if he got him past the first, he'd have no difficulty in winning the fight. And I don't think that was exactly the case, but there was definitely evidence there to suggest that he wasn't too far off in his theory. Carlisle did treat us to one of the strangest things I've seen inside of the octagon in a long time. So basically, there was seconds to go in the first round, and he decided to disembark Billy and walk back to his corner. So he basically had his back to Billy, and there was about 6 seconds left. So Billy got up off the ground, sprinted towards Carlisle, and hit him with a right hook from behind. Carlisle, I think he initially seemed surprised, but what he was doing walking back to his corner before the bell is just amazing, really. I think that incident, coupled with the fact that he didn't put Quarantillo away in the first round, might suggest that he won't go too far in the UFC unless he improves on those things, of course. I think a more experienced fighter, when they were in such a dominant position, would have probably went for quality over quantity, because a lot of the strikes he threw were wild and they didn't actually hurt Billy, and he got up after the first round relatively unscathed. There's definitely some question marks over his cardio as well. After Quarantillo got on top of him in the second, his breathing rate increased dramatically. In the empty venue, you could hear every breath being really heavy. And I think it showed in the third, where I don't have the figures in front of me, but I think it was 5 significant strikes he threw, as opposed to Quarantillo had 30 plus. So he really failed in the third round with regards to his cardio. I think if he can fix these issues, he definitely has a future, because he's very marketable and his cult following will just continuously grow and grow. I'll definitely be tuning in for his next fight, and I really hope that he can get a win and get back on track. Quarantillo, on the other hand, I believe that Dana White's a big fan of him after the Contender Series and after that win at the weekend. So whether he'll get a ranked opponent next, I don't know, but he's called for a big name, and he says that he's the future of the division and to get used to it, because he's going to be around for a long time. So fair play to him and his win, and I wish him all the best. I'm going to leave the recap of that fight night there, and I'm going to move on to what could possibly be in store next for my fellow compatriot Conor McGregor. I'm going to take a quick step back to just over a week ago when Conor posted on Twitter his greatest of all time UFC fighters list. He named Anderson Silva as the greatest fighter of all time, and in typical McGregor fashion put himself in second place and said that his career is not over yet and by the end he will be number one. I'm not going to get embroiled in a big Conor debate with regards GOAT lists, as I'm sure there'll be too much hate developed on the back of that. But from this, Anderson Silva called him out on Twitter and said that he would really like to fight him, and Conor replied saying, "Fight accepted." I think at this stage of Conor's career you have to tick a certain amount of boxes for him to accept a fight with you, because there has to be something that's unique. And I guess the most unique point of fighting Anderson would be that you'd have to fight him at middleweight, i.e. 185 pounds. This would mean that Conor would have fought in the UFC in featherweight, lightweight, welterweight and middleweight. So that would add another record to his own personal history. Secondly, he will be fighting one of the greatest UFC fighters of all time in Anderson Silva. But this fight has actually received a lot of backlash on Twitter. Mainly fans are citing the fact that Anderson is just after having an operation on his knee from a very serious injury he picked up back in Brazil just over a year ago in his fight versus Jared Cannonier. The fact that Anderson now is 45 years old as well, he's obviously not the same fighter that he was when he had his 10 successful title defences. Although fans are saying it's a relatively pointless fight, I still think that there is some merit in it. It will be very impressive for a former featherweight to fight in middleweight, especially in a promotion with the calibre of the UFC. And I think Anderson will see it as an easy paycheck for himself, given that he would be the supremely bigger man in the fight. I'm not too sure that Dana White will see it as the next fight for Conor McGregor, but then again, stranger things have happened. I think Conor has a lot of influence in who he fights, and if he says, right, I want to fight Anderson, that could be it. And sometimes these things actually move very quickly when contracts are being signed. I don't think it'll happen, but I wouldn't rule it 100% out. The one fight that makes the most sense, and the one that the fans are crying out for, is the fight between Tony Ferguson and Conor McGregor. They have had exchanges in the past, and there was points where we thought the fight was going to be made. I believe a lot of people might remember the Grand Theft Auto style memes that they were sending each other on Twitter, I believe. But ultimately the fight never got made, and Conor got penciled in to fight Khabib ahead of Tony. I think it would be the perfect match to make stylistically as well, and I think that it would be an extremely entertaining fight. My only concern is that Tony took a lot of damage versus Gaethje, and if they were to rush him back for that fight, if they wanted to make it soon, he may not be the same fighter. And just overall, he took so much damage in that fight, he may never be the same fighter again. But nonetheless, I think it would be the fairest way if Conor could beat him to get the rematch with Khabib. And he basically shut up every fan on the internet who's saying that he doesn't deserve the immediate rematch with Khabib. But looking past this, Dana White did come out yesterday and say that he wants to wait until Gaethje and Khabib fight in September, and the winner will face Conor McGregor. So I think it's the cash cow for the UFC, and they might be hoping that they could be the first company to get the gate back. And we all know Dana finds it very hard to pass up a Conor tour and gate before his fights, so they might just hold him back, and they wouldn't want to risk a possible loss to any other opponent to make that match not happen. Next, there was the reports that came out suggesting that the UFC were looking into making Kamaru Usman versus McGregor for the welterweight title. Before looking at this, I think the funniest thing that came out of it was actually from Ali Abdelaziz. He notably came out multiple times saying that McGregor has to win 10 fights in a row before he can get the rematch with Khabib. But once reports surfaced of this, he starts promoting it to the max, trying to get that fight between Usman, one of his fighters, and McGregor. I can see a certain level of hypocrisy there, but I can see where Ali's coming from in that Usman has notably one of the worst gates and pay-per-view buys of all UFC champions, so a fight versus McGregor would ultimately end that. I don't think the fight will happen, but the longer the speculation over breakdowns in the negotiations between Usman and Masvidal. I suppose more fuel will be added to the fire there, as the UFC will want a big fight. So unlikely, but could potentially happen. I wouldn't hang my hat on it. Personally, the fight that I want to see would be for the baddest motherfucker belt between Masvidal and McGregor. I think that there'd be fireworks on this one, and I think that the embeddeds and whatever media that they can provide would just be absolutely gold between the two of them. I think that McGregor as well would actually have a great chance in winning that fight. I still have question marks over Masvidal. I know that a lot of people might strongly disagree with that, but I'm just looking at, it was an impressive, spectacular knockout against Askren, but it was still the first few seconds of the fight, and I don't think that Askren was the fighter in the UFC that he was when he left one. I think that the hip problems definitely played a part in that. And the win against Darren Till, it was a very impressive knockout, but Till did rock him. And Till at welterweight, he was just too big for the division. The weight cuts, he was passing out in saunas, and he just never looked like a natural welterweight. And I think that proved true when he moved up to middleweight, and he's had an impressive start there with his win against Kevin Gastelum. But back to Masvidal, when he fought Nate Diaz, he did dominate the first 2 rounds, but Diaz slowly started to grow into the fight before the doctor stopped it, and I think that McGregor will be able to land. I don't think that the fight is extremely unlikely to happen either, because before McGregor came back in his bout versus Cerrone, those may remember he listed out the McGregor season, as he called it, for the year, and one of the fights he listed was the fight for the baddest motherfucker belt versus Jorge Masvidal. So it's definitely a fight that Conor wants, and if the negotiations keep on stalling, as I said, between Usman and Masvidal, it could be the fight that the UFC might want to make. Ultimately, if I was a betting man, I think that they're going to hold Conor McGregor until around Christmas time to fight the winner of Khabib versus Gaethje. I think that they've just come out too many times saying that it's the fight that they want to make, and it is the money fight which they won't want to risk a loss on. I'm going to conclude this episode of the podcast by just taking a look at Jon Jones's dispute with the UFC over the past number of weeks. So for those who don't know too much about it, basically there's been a very public back and forth between Dana White and Jon Jones, where Jones basically feels he's not being paid his worth. Jones came out and said that he wants to earn Wilder money, referring to the $30 million that Deontay Wilder earned in his last fight versus Tyson Fury. But Dana's been responding, saying that Jones has been paid a very fair amount, and that Jones should go public and discuss the actual fee he was paid to give the public a take on what they deem as being fair or not, which to me sounds like, yeah, he should do it if he has such an issue with it. But Jon Jones has failed to do that yet. The dispute seems to have come to a head last night, where Jon Jones has tweeted saying that he wishes to vacate his UFC light heavyweight title, and for the UFC to contact him in 2021 if they're willing to pay him his worth so that they can set up a fight with Israel Adesanya. I don't like siding with the UFC when it comes to fighters' pay, as I think that a lot of fighters are just getting paid incredibly low amounts, considering they're putting their lives on the line every time they set foot into the cage. But on this occasion, I'm actually going to side with Dana. The amount of support that they've gave Jon Jones over the years has been unparalleled with nearly any other athlete in any other sport. They've basically let him away with his hit and run, his DUI, his DWI, the incident in the strip club, and most notably the multiple failed drug tests. Also, in the current economic climate where worldwide people are taking wage cuts, I just don't think it's just that Jon Jones be demanding the same wages as the WBC champion in one of the oldest sports in the world, in the only fight that really makes that amount of money in boxing. Taking my MMA hat off, I'll admit that Fury versus Wilder was definitely going to make more pay-per-view buys than Jones and Ngannou would, so I don't see how the wages could ever be comparable. Also, if they were to pay Jon Jones those staggering wages, I'd imagine they'd have to make it up from other fighters on the card, and others would have to take the hit for Jon to get paid more, which I also don't think would be completely fair. For Jon's sake, I really hope that this does get resolved and he remains active, because we all know that when he does get time to himself, it isn't long before he lands himself in trouble, and I wouldn't like to see that. So best wishes to him and the UFC. I'm sure they can get together and come to some sort of resolution. So that brings us to the end of this week's episode. I'd like to thank anyone who's stuck around to listen this far, and I would greatly appreciate if you could drop our Twitter page a follow at Orbital MMA on Twitter. Thanks guys, stay safe.